The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 9. Chattel, and Cattle. Richard turned away from the bookcase and accepted the proffered drink from Lucius. "To strong friendships," Richard echoed, sipping the cool ginger gin and finding it far more palatable than fire whiskey. "This is good. I found the fire whiskey a tad strong." As he said it, his eyes widened slightly. He hadn't intended to say that out loud. It was assumed that as a man you liked the taste of whiskey neat. No one ever admitted to finding it too strong, and yet he just had. But Lucius seemed to ignore this. "So, Hermione told Draco that she was adopted. Is that correct?" "Yes. Linda was unable to have children because of an illness she had as a child." Why had he told Lucius this part? It wasn't Lucius's business, really. He had been thirsty, and had finished off half his glass in the first sip. This gin must be deceptively strong. He should be more careful. Not that Hermione's adoption was a secret, of course. They had told her that she had been adopted from a young age, and had no problems telling others. It was true, Hermione did look a bit like Richard, which led to a few confusing and sometimes funny moments over the years. But they always wanted her to know that she had been chosen, that they had wanted her especially. Richard and Linda had both longed for a large family, but it had not been in the cards for them. Still, they were over the moon to have the chance to adopt Hermione. But Linda's infertility had always been a sensitive thing for her, and Richard felt a bit ashamed for having revealed it to Lucius. "Who are Hermione's birth parents?" The mother was from northern England. She was married to a man in the Black Watch, but he was away on an extended mission. Her husband didn't want children. She got in the family way with another man and didn't want to keep the baby. She was afraid to tell her husband because the baby's father was his commander. We learned about her situation through an intermediary acquaintance in the service and adopted the baby." Lucius gasped and stood stock still, processing all of this information. The Black Watch. This had to be a group of Death Eaters. He could only think of 2 Blacks, who, without any shadow of a doubt, had been Death Eaters, Regulus Black and Bellatrix Black Lestrange. Bellatrix had married a Lestrange soon after leaving Hogwarts, and whilst the Lestrange family was quite well off and was part of the Sacred 28, they were not completely accepted in pure-blood society. There had been controversy in their ancestral lines, and the descendants still lived with that pall hanging over their name. The Black Watch. It would make complete sense if Bellatrix's husband Rodolphus and his brother Ravestan had used Bellatrix's and her cousin's name as a way of distinguishing themselves among the Death Eaters. He needed more information. "So this woman, she fell in love with their leader?" "Well, I don't know if you would call it love, but yeah, that seemed to be the short of it. Granted, the man was quite gregarious and engaging. I knew him a bit better. I only met her a couple of times, right before she had Hermione. I suppose you have to be convivial to be a commander, and the Black Watch is a very elite unit." Yes, that would fit. He recalled Bellatrix often throwing herself at the Dark Lord, giving him suggestive looks, flirting with him. She was never very demure about it. She wanted the Dark Lord for her own, and had treated her marriage to Rodolphus as a mere formality, almost from the moment the ink on the marriage contract had dried. "When was Hermione born?" September 19th, 1979. The middle of September. That would put her conception date. Lucius performed quick calculations in his head. Around Christmas, 1978. He would come back to that later. The Veritaserum would only work for a short time more. Richard had already abandoned the ginger gin, and might become suspicious soon.
"Tell me more about your work."
We see lots of folks, about 10 or 12 a day. It's good to stay busy, always something different, mostly just cleanings or fillings. Once in a while, an avulsion or an excision." Yes, this would be his cover story, then. Lucius knew that Richard now acted as a Muggle healer of some sort.
"But occasionally I do have to do extractions."
Extraction? That sounded far more sinister.
"Do you mean removal?"
Lucius felt a chill within him that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room.
"Yes, it's a last resort, but sometimes it's necessary. When things become diseased, there's very little you can do. You don't want the rot to spread. It has to be taken out."
Lucius's breath caught in his chest. "I see. And how many of these extractions have you performed?"
Geez, I'd have to say probably in the hundreds."
Lucius staggered backwards, catching himself on the edge of his desk. Hundreds! This man, who gave the image of a mild-mannered Muggle, had been responsible for hundreds of deaths. Even Lucius, no stranger to murder himself, could not believe it. "And is that what you did when you were in his service?" His voice came out almost as a whisper.
"Not at first. I was just a grunt, to begin with, patrols and the like, but I did additional training and I worked my way up. Plenty of bloody situations I found myself in, you can be sure, and there were other missions."
"Indeed. And these extractions, these begin whilst you were serving him?" This last word was nearly a whisper.
"Yes, I did some of those in the service. I admit, though, I was a bit of a brute. I didn't know what I was doing then, and sometimes it was more painful than it needed to be."
"And now?"
"Oh, I'm a bit better at it. Though, to be honest, Linda's the real smooth operator when it comes to extractions."
Linda? She had always seemed so mild-mannered. Could she be an assassin?
"Yes, indeed. Well, it only makes sense. She's much smaller than me. She can get into tight spaces easier. She can do an extraction before anyone even realizes it's happening to them. She's very gentle about it. I can never finesse it so well. Linda's a real professional, very skilled."
Lucius's head was spinning. He had to get out of here, had to go and find Narcissa. She had to know who she was entertaining in her garden. They sat on the dock of the Malfoy Lake, watching the little kelpie as it frolicked and played in the water in front of them. Draco was true to his word. Kirby did take on the shape of a terrier, frolicking and cavorting across the surface of the water, occasionally diving down underneath as Draco tossed it a little ball. "So, this Triwizard Tournament, do you think you're going to put your name in for it?" Hermione asked guardedly. She had studied up on it when it had been mentioned the week before at dinner. Students and judges had died in the past, and it did not seem like a wise endeavour. "My father wants me to." "It seems really dangerous, Draco. I've read about the history of them. People have died, you know." He turned to her, smirking. "Are you worried about me, Hermione?" "I just want everyone to be safe, Pratt. Is there something wrong with that?" She smirked back, leaning back on her elbows to enjoy the first rays of the sunset. Draco's expression fell. "Oh." In that moment he looked so forlorn, and she felt a tug on her heart. "But yes, I would be worried about you, specifically, if you were chosen." She sat up then, placing a hand over his as it rested on the surface of the dock. "I do care about you, you know." His silver eyes looked into hers, bright, shining copper that caught the reflected evening sun, making them seem to almost glow. "I care about you, too." The words came automatically to Draco. I like you very much." She leaned in, then, her eyes half-lidded as her body moved towards him. Their lips met, gently at first. He raised a hand, cupping it against the side of her neck, and deepened the kiss. Her lips parted in surprise, and he pressed his tongue questioningly, tentatively, against them. She surged towards him, a deep moan in her throat as she did so. There was a tiny pop in the air behind them on the dock.
"The presence of Miss Granger and Master Draco is requested for dinner," said the adorable elf, who stood there.
"Oh!" Hermione startled, smoothing down her skirt, even though it had not moved. "Thanks, Pym," Draco said, although from his tone he didn't sound thankful at all. Hermione looked sideways at him and could see the pink flush to his cheeks. She was certain her own looked the same. "We'll be there in just a minute."
"Do Master Draco and Miss Granger wish to come with Pym?"
The small elf held out an arm, offering apparition. There was a hint of amusement in the old elf's eyes.
"No, we can walk," Draco grumbled. "You can go now, thanks."
The small elf popped away, and Hermione giggled uncontrollably in embarrassment.
"I'm pretty sure he was acting as my mother's spy," Draco groused. "Treacherous little bugger. He's supposed to be my elf."
"What does that mean? Your elf? Isn't he a servant?"
"Yes, he's a servant. Why?"
They stood, turning towards the manor house. Almost automatically, Draco reached for her hand, lacing his fingers in hers. The warmth of his hand travelled up her arm, sending a zip of electricity into the pit of her stomach. "By servant, you mean he's staff, right? Does he live here?" Draco's brow furrowed as though he had never considered the question.
"Yes, of course. His magic is tied to the house, to our family."
"Tied to? Do you mean bound? Can he leave?"
"I don't think so. Not unless we send him somewhere."
It was Hermione's turn to knit her eyebrows together in consternation. "Is he paid?"
Draco laughed uproariously. "Salazar sack! I can't imagine the tantrum Pym would throw if I offered him money."
Hermione's footsteps slowed. Draco's hand in hers, which for a moment before had given her such a thrill of excitement, now felt a little like a lead weight. "So your elves are tied to the house? They can't leave, and they don't make any money? And you dress them as beggars?" This last word was practically spat out in anger.
"Granger, if we gave them clothes, that would give them their freedom. They don't want that. They would be disgraced, shunned by their own kind."
Her anger was reaching a boiling point now. "So, you have the ability to free them, and yet you won't? You would be so cruel?"
"It isn't cruelty. Elves, they love to serve. It's what they're born for. If we freed them, they'd have nowhere to go, nothing to do. It would be like saying that you and I were being forced to be witches or wizards. It's what we were born to do, and we enjoy it."
"Up until a few years ago, I thought I was born to be a doctor. I didn't know any better. It wasn't until someone came and told me, enlightened me, that I was able to make my own path." They had stopped now, under an apple tree still several yards from the lanai of the manor.
"Hermione, I get that you're worried about the elves. I have to say I don't understand it, but I get it. The thing is, they like what they're doing, and no amount of telling them anything different would change that."
She pursed her lips together in anger. This discussion wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she could tell that the issue was much larger than just this one elf, this one wizard. They could table the conversation for now, but if she had anything to say about it, that elf and everyone like him would have his freedom one day. After dinner that night, Richard and Linda were shown to the nicest guest room in the East Wing, a few rooms away from Hermione's.
"What an odd night!"
Richard groaned softly, as he undressed, loosening his tie and hanging it carefully over the door of the wardrobe.
Lucius was acting even stranger than usual before dinner. Wanted to know about Hermione's adoption."
Linda wrinkled her nose in confusion.
"That is weird. I don't know what to make of it. Narcissa said he has his peculiarities, and to just ignore them." "How so?"
"Oh, back in the day, when they were young, she said that Lucius fancied himself a soldier of sorts. He wanted to serve, but wasn't really able to, so he enjoys hearing about it, I guess. And he's a little bit enamored with the idea of you being in the service. That's why he brings it up so much."
Linda approached him and turned her back. "Unzip me, darling."
Richard unzipped her dress, sliding it off her shoulders. She caught it as it fell down her arms.
"It seems that he thinks she was some sort of special agent in the service," she said,
turning her head and wiggling her eyebrows suggestively at him.
"Ah, yes. Well, that would make sense, then."
He ran his hand along her bare shoulders, tucking his index fingers under her bra straps.
"Well, you know, I did provide support for some elite units. There were dangerous situations, Lindy Hop."
His voice had dropped an octave, and he murmured this last sentence in her ear seductively. She giggled. His breath tickled, and she could feel the wine at dinner making her more relaxed.
You're right. I do remember you telling me about patching up that poor sergeant after he got drunk and hopped into that cow pasture in Northern Ireland late one night. What was he doing, trying to find terrorist cows?"
Richard turned her to face him, kissing her neck.
Yes, I told him he should steer clear, but he wouldn't listen."
She giggled.
"Hush! I don't think I will. Come on, get in bed. It's pasture bedtime."
She smiled widely, letting him lead her to the imposing four-poster bed in the center of the room.
"Everything goes in one ear and out the other with you, doesn't it?"
She climbed on the bed, then turned and sat, trailing her bra straps slowly down her arms, as he stood at the side of the bed watching the show.
"I am an utter disaster when it comes to you,"
Richard murmured, unbuttoning his shirt and tossing it to the floor. She reached for his belt buckle, working quickly to push down his trousers.
"You do seem to have all the right moves," she said,
palming his cock through his pants. She made a satisfied groan in the back of her throat. "Oh, I'm going to milk this for all it's worth." It was Richard's turn to groan softly. He pushed her shoulders back so that she fell upon the bed. Her arms raised over her head luxuriantly, and she squirmed a bit against the lush sheets of the down-turned bed. He reached for her waistband and pulled her violet silken knickers down her legs slowly, fingers running along the lengths of her thighs and calves. His wife was so beautiful, so perfect. He lowered his mouth to the slight round of her stomach, kissing gently as she sighed for him. He worked his way down slowly, caressing the soft skin of her thighs. He knelt beside the bed, gazing at her adoringly. She was so wet for him, and he told her so lovingly, hungrily. He pulled her body a bit towards him and licked her quim gently, languidly, tongue and lips working against her perfect cunt, bringing her to climax with the practiced familiarity of a worshipping lover. "Richard! Richard, yes! Oh, my God, that's perfect!" Linda cried, and it was. He moaned against her as he felt her body tighten beneath his mouth and hands. She was phenomenal, and there were so many times in their lives that, when Richard really sat back and thought about what he had, he was astonished at his sheer luck. He kissed her thighs once, twice, wiping his cheeks against her, then stood, palming his cock that was struggling, fighting for its chance to bask in her beauty. Then he was thrusting inside of her, their bodies moving together, chasing a crescendo of delight. As they lay spooned together several minutes later, he whispered in her ear, "That was legendary." She laughed softly. "Go to sleep, Special Agent Richard. We have a long day tomorrow." "Come now, Lucius, it couldn't have been that bad." Narcissa was rubbing lotion into her face and neck as they prepared for bed.
"You didn't hear him, Narcissa. He said hundreds! And you need to be careful around Linda. I think she's just as dangerous."
Narcissa only laughed quietly. Long after his wife had fallen asleep next to him, Lucius lay awake, replaying bits of his conversation with Richard. Finally, giving up on the idea of sleep, he crept back down the stairs to his study. Removing the pensieve from his cabinet, he sat at the desk, mulling over half-forgotten memories of a Christmas many years before. After a moment, he placed his wand point at his temple, withdrawing a strand of silver vapour that he deposited into the pensieve. He had been drunk that evening, long ago. Narcissa had awoken the morning of their annual Yule party with cramping. The cramps often came at the start of a miscarriage. If that's what would have happened this time, it would be their third. Lucius longed for a son, a child to share his life with. He knew it would happen one day, but he had hoped that this would be the one. The fire whiskey took the edge off all of that. The Yule party that year was mostly attended by Death Eaters and their wives and children, but Rodolphus and his brother Rabistan had not come. Narcissa had questioned Bellatrix about that. They were away on a mission, she'd said. Past Lucius had been carousing with Goyle and Not when present-day Lucius saw it. Bellatrix, whispering in the Dark Lord's ear. The Dark Lord standing, gliding across the room behind her. Her face stretched in a wide, maniacal grin. Just as they reached the door, Bellatrix turned, running a hand down the length of the Dark Lord's robes, stopping just below his waist. She gave his robes a suggestive tug as she whispered something to him, and they disappeared through the door. 9 months later, the baby that would soon be known as Hermione Granger would be born. Lucius emerged from the pensieve, trying to think back as to whether he had ever seen Bellatrix pregnant. He could not be certain. 1979 had been a busy time for him as well. Narcissa had indeed miscarried a few days later, only to fall pregnant again in the middle of September. Missions from the Dark Lord had been fragmented but frequent. Lucius had mainly interacted with his own team of Not, Goyle, and Travers. Bellatrix had not attended many meetings that year that he could recall. The Dark Lord seemed to become both more power-hungry and more paranoid as the days and months of 1979 and 1980 stretched on. Lucius did recall Bellatrix coming to visit soon after Draco was born in June of 1980. He swiftly raised his wand again to his temple, withdrawing the memory.
"He's adorable, Sissy. I know you're proud," Bellatrix had said. "I know I would be, if I had a son."
At these words, Bellatrix's mouth tightened, and her gaze moved to the window, taking in the lush late spring rose garden below. Past Lucius had been standing across the room, making conversation with Siobhan Flint. She had stopped by with their 4-year-old son Marcus to bring a baby gift. Past him had been focused on containing the annoying child, who seemed hell-bent on stomping on someone's feet before the day was done. But present-day him watched Bellatrix's expression carefully. She had not said, "If I were to have a son," or even, "If I had a son." She had said, "If I had had a son." Was she only speaking hypothetically? Or was it a slip of the tongue? Was that sadness or a regret on her face? Was she thinking of a child that she would never carry, or the child she had given up? He could not be sure, but he feared the worst. Was this, then, Richard Granger's ultimate mission? Had he and his professional assassin wife been chosen to raise the daughter of the Dark Lord?
Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Muggle Death Eater by Great 78.